It does refer to war and battle and all of that stuff, and I wanted you guys to look at those questions. What is the importance of the word if? If you become my disciple. What does that imply?
You might not.
You don't have to.
Yeah.
God does not force you, right? That you can be in his army, and like we learned in we can wait the sermon a little bit. God invites us, but do you have to? Unfortunately, some people refuse it, right? And so that's important to understand. What's the hyperbole here in verse 26? He wants you to what, your parents? Hate them?
This isn't right.
Does he want you to hate your parents? No, he's using hyperbole to help you understand what? God has to be what in your life? He's got to be number one. He can't be, something that's important, but, these other things, we can't play that game in our lives. So when Jesus uses hyperbole, he's really trying to emphasize an extremely important point. Go beyond what your typical relationships are and put God absolutely number one first in your life. And what does that mean sometimes? When you put something else before you, well, he uses the term carry your cross. We're all pretty familiar with that term, right? Sometimes there is going to be a burden. Sometimes there is going to be a difficulty. How far are you willing to go to be a disciple of Christ? Well, it better be all the way even to your death. And I think you guys are familiar with Philippians 2 that has all these descriptions of Jesus. And one of them is he was obedient to the Father, even to his death. Jesus is all in with the Father. He's all in for us. Are we all in for him? Okay? So that strong language of hate, of carrying your cross, it's being used for a purpose, to really get you to understand what your relationship needs to be. So why does Jesus want us to know ahead of time the cost of being a disciple? If you're going to battle, what don't you want from your troops? Yeah, I'll be a soldier, fine, I'll go with you. And then halfway through the battle, oh, I don't want this anymore. This is horrible. Okay? God doesn't want that. Okay? We do that with sports a lot of times. I know Eric does this, basketball program does this. We have a meeting at the beginning before the season even starts. And what do we say to the parents and the athletes? Here's all the requirements. Okay? Here's the schedule. There's going to be some Saturday practice. For basketball, during the holidays, yes, we are going to practice. Here's some financial obligations. You got to pay for your shoes and whatever. Okay? Here's your grades. They have to be at this level. Okay? So before the season even starts, we want you to know this is what the expectations are. Because what don't we want halfway through the season? I really don't want to be a part of this. Okay? We want people to know ahead of. Jesus wants us to know ahead of time, right? Here's what it means to be a disciple. So if you are going to be a disciple, here's what the things are that you have to do. Here's all the expectations, all the requirements. And so how do most people respond in verse 33? Really? I have to give up everything?
Say forget it.
I'm really expected to do that? Now, I was talking to Abby yesterday about this. This does not mean you can't have things in life. Certainly you can have things in life. Okay? Enjoy what God has blessed you with. Okay? The point is, are you willing to give that up? And so, I've always been told in Scripture, there's three temptations that most people struggle with because they're pretty consistent throughout the Bible. Money, power, and sex. Those three things tempt people the most. Okay? So something like money. It's not a sin to have it, but what's the problem for a lot of people? Once you do have it, you're not willing to give it up. Well, you always want more, right? There's been plenty of sociology and psychology studies. What is the person who gets this amount of money? Just a little more, and then I'd be comfortable. But also, when you do have a lot of something, it is difficult a lot of times to give that up or to give it all up. And that's what Jesus wants us to understand. Okay? And so Philippians 3, did you guys read that? That's that famous passage of Paul saying, actually, let's read that. Such good work. 3, verses 7 and 8. But whatever gain I had, whatever it is, apply whatever's in your head to that. I count it as loss for the sake of Christ. Indeed, I count everything as a loss because of the surpassing worth of knowing Christ Jesus my Lord. For his sake, I have suffered the loss of all things and count them as rubbish in order that I may gain Christ. What is he basically saying? He had a lot of stuff. And what was he willing to do with all of that great stuff? Power, glory, all the things that he had. He was willing to give it all up because who is first and who's more important? Certainly Christ is. Okay? Certainly Christ is. So it's just a mindset that we have to have as soldiers of Christ going into the battle. Right? I'm willing to give it all up for him. Christ doesn't want us to go halfway into the battle and say, I'm out of here. Okay? Sometimes the battle can get difficult. All right? All right. So let's all turn to Psalm 83 now. And we're going to start talking about battles.
What's the page?
Psalm 83. You know where Psalm 83 is.
In the middle of the Bible.
In the middle of the Bible.
I haven't used a Bible in a very long time.
No, that is not true. I know you haven't been in religion class in a long time. All right. Israel has a lot of enemies. Psalm 83, starting at verse 5, starts to list those enemies out. Okay, so if you could read through those, it's an interesting list. And if you have your Bible study, you can look at the notes at the bottom there, and they explain where a lot of these people are descended from. Lot's descendants, Noah's sons' descendants, Ham, and so forth. Esau's descendants. And one of those descendants are the Edomites. Who are the Edomites? Those are so Edom down here south of Judah. The Edomites are Esau's descendants. So the Jews are Jacob's descendants. Esau, his descendants are the Edomites. How did Jacob and Esau get along? They didn't. And how did their descendants get along? They didn't. Okay? So there was always constant fighting here. And by the way, this was really important, this area here, because this is a buffer between Egypt and Judah. So you didn't want to lose control of this area. You're already having lots of problems with the Philistines. You don't want Egypt expanding up this way and causing problems. So this southern border was always really critical for Judah. By the way, you know what great king during Jesus' time was an Edomite? King Herod. So not only did the Jews have the Romans that they hated, they had an Edomite king over them, King Herod. So yeah, that history there, pretty rough. Okay? And so look at verse 9 then. I always love this. I learned this several years ago. Did you know that there was a prayer that you could pray to curse people? When I learned that, my sinful nature took over. Like I have the power to, voodoo doll people, okay? Get that guy, Lord. It's terrible. No, that's not what the imprecatory prayer is about.
There are no such thing as spells.
No, there shouldn't be.
Because there isn't.
But they were asking God, the psalmist here, to basically do to the Edomites what God had done to other enemies, like the Midianites. Kill them all. Okay? So the bad blood, very, very tense. Okay? And even Psalm 137, verse 7, gives another example of the hatred between the two groups. Psalm 137 is a little more into the future when the Babylonians come and they wipe out Jerusalem. What did the Edomites do when they heard about this? Woohoo! Go get them, Babylon.
Yeah.
They celebrated. And so the psalmist is like, curse these people. Okay? This is an ongoing rivalry.
We kind of skipped over the Ishmaelites. Aren't we still feeling
The Arab people are the descendants of the Ishmaelites.
And
Yeah, Hagar's
that
son.
was a thorn in everybody's side.
Yeah.
And I think it's one of ours too.
Absolutely. I know a lot of history teachers who their view of history begins with Isaac and Ishmael and the tension there. So you could start there with that great rivalry. So yeah, the prophets spoke against the Edomites constantly, okay, as a just terrible, awful people that the Jews and God needed to deal with, okay. No love lost between those two groups. So let's now go to 2 Chronicles chapter 21. We haven't gone to Chronicles, have we? 2 Chronicles chapter 21. All right, we're going to start with King Jehoram. Now I got to make a side note here before we read this section. I think it's really good for you guys as I kind of go through various battles and various kings to kind of read more 1 Kings, 2 Kings, 1 Chronicles, 2 Chronicles on your own. But here's the tricky part. I'm going to be Captain Obvious here. Reading the Old Testament can be difficult. Okay? because you have a lot of names and a lot of places and a lot of dates, and they don't always match up perfectly, and so it can be confusing. So again, when you have a book, a Bible with notes, or you get some sort of commentary, it really helps. So there's two Jehorams. Did you know that? There's one in Judah and there's one in Israel. They're at the same time, different dudes, brothers-in-law, making history and making studying this stuff more difficult. As I looked up Jehoram, and we started talking about this guy, and I wanted to talk about that guy, and it got confusing sometimes, so we always have to be careful when we study Old Testament stuff. All right, so I'm going to read verses 4 through 9. It says, when Jehoram had ascended the throne of his father and was established, he killed all his brothers with the sword. Well, that's not nice.
No, that's not what I mean. It's just very, 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 very evil.
It is evil, yes. And also
There's
some
a difference between mean and evil.
That's true. Thank you, Ben. And also some of the princes of Israel. Stop right there.
It's more of a bullying way.
I read something where sometimes Israel is called Israel, just the northern, what I usually refer to it, but sometimes it's the whole thing. So that's another one of those confusing things sometimes, which Israel is talking about. But anyway, verse 5. Jehoram was 32 years old when he became king, and he reigned 8 years in Jerusalem, and he walked in the ways of Israel, as the house of Ahab had done, for the daughter of Ahab was his wife. And he did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. Yet the Lord was not willing to destroy the house of David. Remember, all the kings of Judah are on that line of David, okay? And he did what was evil in the eyes of the Lord. Yet the Lord was not willing to destroy the house of David because of the covenant that he had made with David, and since he had promised to give a land to him and to his sons forever. In his days, Edom revolted from the rule of Judah and set up a king of their own. Then Jehoram passed over with his commanders and all his chariots. That's important. What did we say before about technology and warfare? Chariots were the big deal. Iron chariots were a big deal. Whoever had those, they've got the advantage. And he rose by night and struck the Edomites who had surrounded him and his chariot commanders. So Edom revolted from the rule of Judah to this day. All right, I got to explain that because the writer there doesn't go into detail. Here's what happened in this battle. All right, so Edom rebelling. Okay, remember David and Solomon had expanded the borders, taken up a lot of the Edomite territory. Jehoshaphat, Jehoram's father, had put down some rebellions. Now they're rebelling again, and Jehoram is going to try to get this rebellion under control. And so with his chariots he comes, and they find out that their chariots in this terrain, they don't work very well. All right, so I want to show a picture. They don't have a, I don't know if you can see that, but that's pretty much the terrain, okay? It reminds me of when we were in Tucson, Arizona over the summer. There's nothing, there's no way to get your chariots around there. So they were useless. So Jehoram's army sets up camp here at Zoar, and the Edomite forces were at Mount Selah or Seir, and so sometimes the Bible calls the Edomites the Seirites or the Selites. It's all the same thing. They came and attacked in the middle of the night, And so Jehoram and his forces had to flee. And it really made them look pretty stupid. Okay? So Jehoram was embarrassed by this whole thing. It was a big blow to him that he couldn't get the Edomites under control. Okay? Especially knowing his father Jehoshaphat was successful before him. Okay? So let's, 2 Chronicles, 21. And so let's look at verse 16 now. Jehoram, not good. And the Lord stirred up against Jehoram the anger of the Philistines and of the Arabians, Ishmaelites, who are near the Ethiopians. And they came up against Judah and invaded it, and carried away all the possessions they found that belonged to the king's house, and also his sons and his wives, so that no son was left to him except Jehoahaz, his youngest son. And I believe my notes said Jehoahaz is often called Ahaziah, who would be the next in line. Okay. So what happens when you don't do well as an army dealing with the rebellion? Everybody else goes, ooh, they're pretty weak. Let's see what we can do. So it seemed like the Philistines were under control under David, under Solomon. But once they get a sniff of weakness, here comes the Philistines. Here comes other people out of Africa. Okay? And they're all, remember, this territory here, everybody wants this. So if you're weak, everybody's going to try to take this territory because of all the trade routes. And so Jehoram, it was just all falling apart. So verse 18. And after all this, the Lord struck him, so if it wasn't bad enough, in his bowels with an incurable disease. It reminds me of an imprecatory prayer that I once did. I'm from Indiana. I'm a Hoosiers fan. And in the NCAA tournament one year, we were playing Kentucky. And I prayed that prayer against Kentucky's basketball team. Wasn't that terrible of me? That a virus would come over them before the game. God didn't listen and lost. With an incurable disease, verse 19. In the course of time, at the end of 2 years, 2 years, his bowels came out because of the disease, and he died in great agony. Yes, that makes sense. 2 years of that. Okay, so Jehoram and his military ambitions failed him, and he was just not good. Okay. But the story goes on, because Judah's got to get this Edomite area under control. So now we're going to fast forward a couple generations to Amaziah. So let's go to 2 Chronicles 25. 2 Chronicles 25. So Amaziah is a few kings later. And we're going to start reading at verse 5. Then Amaziah assembled the men of Judah and set them by fathers' houses under commanders of thousands and hundreds for all Judah and Benjamin. He mustered those 20 years old and upward and found that they were 300,000 choice men, fit for war, able to handle spear and shield. I want to stop right there. Going back to 1 Samuel chapter 8, when they said, we want a king, and God said, one of the problems of having a king is he's going to force your sons into battle. Good example of it right here. Verse 6. He hired also 100,000 mighty men of valor from Israel, so the northern tribes, for 100 talents, so he's paying them. He's forcing his people, but he's paying the others. And verse 7, but a man of God came to him and said, O king, do not let the army of Israel go with you, for the Lord is not with Israel. That's important. Be careful who you make your alliances with. With all these Ephraimites, that's another way of saying Israelites. But go, act, be strong for the battle. Why should you suppose that God will cast you down before the enemy? For God has power to help or to cast down. And Amaziah said to the man of God, but what shall we do about the 100 talents that I had given to the army of Israel? That sounds like my father right there. Well, wait a second now. I just spent a lot of money on this. Okay? Sounds like me right now. Cheap German. Verse 10. Then Amaziah discharged the army that had come to him from Ephraim, Israel, to go home again. And they became very angry with Judah and returned home to fierce anger. But Amaziah took courage and led out his people and went to the valley of Salt. So again, the Dead Sea is oftentimes called the Salt Sea. So this valley is going to be, again, in this basic area we were talking about before, just south. Okay. And 10,000 men of Seir. So again, Seir, Selah, it's the same word. So we're talking about this mountain area in Edom. The men of Judah captured another 10,000 alive and took them to the top of a rock and threw them down from the top of the rock. And they were all dashed to pieces. So they don't treat their prisoners of war very well. Verse 13 then, but the men of the army whom Amaziah sent back, not letting them go with him to battle, raided the cities of Judah from Samaria to... Okay, so Amaziah. Very successful. They get Edom under control for now. Okay, but they're going to lose control of it later. But then look at verse 14. And I'm telling you, I've never read this passage before, and it blew me away. So Amaziah just received a victory from God over the Edomites, their dreaded enemy. Okay, and look at verse 14. After Amaziah came from striking down the Edomites, he brought the gods of the men of Seir, again that's the Edomites, and set them up as his gods and worshiped them, making offerings to them. Now, why does that not make any sense? Because typically in a battle, it's a battle of whose God is greater. And God just clearly demonstrated he's greater. So you usually do what to the others' gods? You destroy them. And their priests and their temples and all that. Why does Amaziah bring the losers' gods to Judah? It doesn't make any sense. This is the dumbest thing I ever read. So I looked it up. And all the note here says, Amaziah makes a bizarre choice. Well, and I looked up a lot of comments. Nobody can explain why he does this. So if you've got an answer for me, because it makes zero sense at all. Okay, very, very puzzling. All right, let's go to the backside now of your sheet. All right, so while that's all going on, dealing with, so who does Judah and Israel have to deal with all the time? All these terrible neighbors, right? The Philistines were by far the worst to deal with. Okay? But the Edomites were bad, the Moabites were bad, Syria was bad, these different Phoenician towns, they were all bad. And it was really difficult. There was always constant fighting. But none of them even close compared to the Assyrians. Not even close. All right? And so Israel and dealing with Assyria, that's a whole nother level of trouble. Okay? All right. So I'm going to go through this pretty quickly. So yeah, Assyria, they would be way over here. And where do they want to expand? They want to expand this way so that they have access to the Mediterranean Sea. So Assyria up here, they first conquered down here so that they could have access to the Persian Gulf. So they dealt with the Babylonians and so forth. But then they start expanding this way. And if they can control all of this area, man, that's going to help their empire greatly. Okay? And so again, poor little Israel, right in the middle of all of this stuff. Okay? So you thought Egypt was bad, you thought the Philistines were bad. Nothing compares to Assyria. And so what does Israel do to deal with all of this? They start making alliances. Okay? Who do they make alliances with? These northern areas. King of Damascus and so forth. Okay? Rezin is his name. And who do they want to, who does King Pekah of Israel want to get into this alliance? He wants Judah, the southern kingdom, to be a part of this alliance as well. Let me get our names again. So Pekah wants to get an alliance with all of those different neighbors, and Jotham is at the same time. And Jotham says, no way, I don't want to make an alliance with you guys. Okay? And then Pekah and the others, man, we got to force them. We need their help. Okay? Jotham dies off. Ahaz is the next king, and he's awful. He's the worst king of Judah ever. But he refuses as well. So what do the Israelite army, the northern kingdom army, and those other northern tribes, Damascus and so forth, what do they all do? They invade Judah. So Israel and all these others invade Judah, and they put Jerusalem under siege. Okay? So what does Ahaz do? The king of Judah, to protect himself. Who would be the best ally to have at this point to save Judah? Not God. You would think God, wouldn't you? But no, that's Assyria. Okay. So Ahaz makes an alliance with the Assyrian emperor Tiglath-Pileser. And what do you do to make sure that we're all good together? You give him money. Where did Ahaz get the money? From the temple. What else do you do to make sure the alliance is secure? You start worshiping gods together. Okay? And so Ahaz sends one of his priests to find out how the Assyrians worshiped. And then the priest comes back to Jerusalem and built a temple, or build an altar in the temple so that they can all worship together. Not good at all, okay? But let's go to 2 Kings chapter 16 and read this real quickly. Starting at verse 1. A lot to read here. 2 Kings chapter 16. All right, in the 17th year of Pekah, the son of Remaliah, Ahaz, the son of Jotham, king of Judah, began to reign. Ahaz was 20 years old, and he began to reign. And he reigned 16 years in Jerusalem, and he did not do what was right in the eyes of the Lord, his God, and his father David had done. But he walked in the way of the kings of Israel. He even burned his son as an offering. Where did we learn that? That's part of Baal worship. Okay? According to the despicable practices of the nations whom the Lord drove out before the people of Israel. And he sacrificed and made offerings on the high places and on the hills and under every green tree. Then Rezin, king of Syria, in Damascus there, and Pekah, the son of Remaliah, king of Israel, came up to wage war on Jerusalem, and they besieged Ahaz, but could not conquer him. At that time, Rezin, the king of Syria, recovered Elath for Syria and drove the men of Judah from Elath and the Edomites came to Elath, where they dwell to this day. So Ahaz sent messengers to Tiglath-Pileser, king of Assyria, saying, I am your servant and your son. Come up and rescue me from the hand of the king of Syria and from the hand of the king of Israel, who are attacking me. Ahaz also took the silver and gold that was found in the house of the Lord and in the treasures of the king's house, and sent a present to the king of Assyria. And the king of Syria listened to him. The king of Assyria marched up against Damascus and took it, carrying its people captive to Kir, and he killed Rezin. When King Ahaz went to Damascus to meet Tiglath-Pileser, king of Syria, he saw the altar that was at Damascus, and King Ahaz sent to Uriah the priest a model of the altar and its pattern, exact in all its details. And Uriah the priest built the altar in accordance with all that King Ahaz had sent from Damascus. So Uriah the priest made it before King Ahaz arrived from Damascus. I want to stop right there. So we talked in last week's study how the monarchy, we transformed from theocracy to monarchy, and the monarchy under David had all power. Religion, the military, everything. And this is a great example of that. When you give so much power in the hands of one or just a few people, and they can do whatever they want with that power, maybe David was okay, but if that's now how we do things, the next guy may not be so good, and the next guy may be even worse. When we put power in the hands of a few, bad things like this happen. They control even religion. Okay? And so verse 12. And when the king came from Damascus, the king viewed the altar. Then the king drew near to the altar and went up on it. And he burned his burnt offering and his grain offering and poured his drink offering and threw the blood of his peace offerings on the altar. So what's going on here? Assyria, these pagan, horrible people, are now united spiritually with Judah. Okay? Not good at all. All right, so let's look at this map again. Back here. I need a requisition from Heather 2 boards. All right, so here's how the Assyrians attacked. So they're coming this way. Cool. Modern technology here. They went this way, and they conquered the coastline first. So they took out Phoenicia, Philistia, and they just kept going down the coastline. So Assyria was just racking up city after city after city along the coast. Then they took Damascus, and then they went here to Hazor. And then they went this way, and they were ready to come in through that way. And they had Israel surrounded, and they were ready to just clamp down and slaughter all of the northern kingdom. Jerusalem was safe, so it thought, okay, because of Ahaz and his alliance. But the rest of the northern kingdom, it was bad. There was no hope. So what happened? Pekah gets assassinated. So that's in 2 Kings 15. And Hoshea takes over. And what does Hoshea do? He says, all right, Assyria, whatever you need, we'll do it for you. So they paid tribute, and basically Hoshea saved the capital. But that was it. Pretty much the rest of the northern kingdom was gone. Assyria had taken thousands, tens of thousands of people captive, But the capital still stayed. Okay? As I'm running out of time here. So, for a while, and then what does Hoshea do? For whatever reason, he thinks, you know what? We're good. Everything's fine. I don't need to pay Assyria anymore. And I think Egypt will help me. We're going to make an alliance with Egypt. Doesn't that sound like a great idea? Okay? And so the next king of Assyria says, whoa, wait a second, I just got word. Israel is not paying their tribute anymore. And so 2 Kings 17 is what we're going to read. The end of Israel comes. Okay? So let's go to 2 Kings 17. Starting at verse 1. It says, the 12th year of Ahaz, king of Judah, Hoshea the son of Elah began to reign in Samaria over Israel, and he reigned 9 years, and he did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, yet not as the kings of Israel who were before him. Against him came Shalmaneser, king of Assyria, so he takes over after Tiglath-Pileser, and Hoshea became the vassal and paid him tribute. But the king of Assyria found treachery in Hoshea, for he had sent messengers to So, king of Egypt, and offered no tribute to the king of Assyria, as he had done year by year. Therefore, the king of Assyria shut him up and bound him in prison. Then the king of Assyria invaded all the land and came to Samaria, and for 3 years he besieged it. In the 9th year of Hoshea, the king of Assyria captured Samaria, and he carried the Israelites away to Assyria and placed them in Halah and on Habor, the river of Gozan, and in the cities of the Medes. And so the reading then goes on as to why God allowed this. Because of the constant idolatry, because of the constant breaking of the covenant, because of the constant unfaithfulness of the Israelites. So yes, Hoshea was the last of the kings of the northern kingdom. Judah's left. Judah's safe for now. Okay? And next week what we're going to learn is a really cool story about King Hezekiah. He's going to be right after Ahaz. Ahaz, awful, terrible. But Hezekiah is going to come after Ahaz. And that's a really cool story because he's going to save Jerusalem from an Assyrian onslaught. It's just a great story. So yeah, this side done. 722 BC is when it was all over with. And Judah's going to last until 586. They get carried off by the Babylonians, but then they'll return, and there will be a remnant that lives on, and finally Jesus comes through that. Yeah.
You may have covered this earlier, because I came to this class, I didn't start it right away, and when we had done a class in our Friday Focus, and what was very helpful to me, and maybe you already covered this,
Sure.
but she gave us a list of all the kings, and
Yeah.
she said whether they were good or bad.
Yeah.
And that really, really helps when you read this, that you understand that. And the other thing is when you said you didn't know why he bowed down and worshipped his gods, you said, I don't know why you did that.
Yeah.
Well, the note in my Bible here says that that was a practice that they did, because when somebody beat you, I mean, when you were in battle and they were really good and all that, and they like would conquer you and everything. Well, then what they would do is say, okay, let's add that God to our gods, and maybe the next time I go into battle, they just added gods all the way.
Polytheism had a way of taking other cultures' gods and just taking them into your culture. Okay? But the point that I'm trying to make is that a lot of times, though, your God wins over their God, you destroyed them and their God. Why are we taking the loser?
Yeah,
That's what doesn't make
yeah,
sense
that's the
sometimes.
question.
Mhm.
It's hard for a woman to understand all this.
It's
We
hard.
really
No,
struggle with all
I'm
this
looking
blood
at
and guts
I'm
and
looking at
everything.
all sorts of commentaries, and nobody really gives a good answer. It doesn't make sense.
It's all really political.
And when politics and religion mix, yikes! You talk about confusing, yeah. So yeah, it is a tough question. So yeah, next week we're going to look at Hezekiah, and his dealing with the Assyrians. Okay, we don't have to deal with this side anymore. Done. But yeah, that list of kings, that is good to know. And that can be sometimes confusing, because some of the kings were good partially and then went bad.
Yeah.
So which side,
I don't know what
good or
to
bad
think.
king? I don't know.
Maybe we say
Partly
sort
good.
of.
Yeah, sort of good. Okay.
Mostly.
Mostly good. All right. Let's pray. Thank you, Lord, for being there for us. Day in, day out. Some days we see your strength. Some days we don't, but we know that you're always there, each and every day, protecting us from the enemies of faith, sin and Satan. Help us to always realize that there is a battle going on around us all the time. Will help us to always be united to you by your power and your spirit. In your name we pray. Amen. Have a good day.